Okay, so I'm wondering who's going to want to slit my throat more by the end of this? Horror fans or musical theater fans? How about both? Because I've got a really meaty subject for tonight's video, that being Sweeney Todd. Attend the tale because we are slicing and dicing our way through this. Let's go.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
Tim Burton's 2007 adaptation of the musical Sweeney Todd is kind of divisive, both in the horror community and the music theater community. It got great critical reviews and a great box office success. It did very well. But in the years since and when it came out, audiences were very divided about this film. And for me, someone coming from a music theater background, I kind of found myself and still find myself in the minority in that I actually really enjoy this movie. And I think it is actually a very good adaptation of the musical. Now, okay, put your forks and everything down. I will explain myself as we go on. But I do want to talk about the Tim Burton version of Sweeney Todd, both as a film unto its own and as an adaptation of Sondheim's beloved musical. To give a little bit of background on Sweeney Todd itself, where the musical comes from that the movie is based on, the character of Sweeney Todd himself originated in a serialized Victorian popular fiction known as Penny Dreadfuls. And it was a story called String of Pearls. It was published as a weekly magazine during the winter of 1846 to 47, set in 1785 in London. It featured the principal villain of Sweeney Todd and included the plot elements that exist in the musical and in the film. However, the musical is more of an adaptation of Christopher Bond's 1973 play Sweeney Todd, which introduced a different element to the story, a motivation and a psychological aspect of Sweeney Todd's murderous villainy. He was the victim of a ruthless, jealous judge who exiled him to Australia with designs on his wife. And then Sweeney Todd returning to London many years later, exacting his revenge. So Stephen Sondheim, who, if you know anything about musical theater, if you are in musical theater at all, you know this name. Sondheim is absolutely beloved. His works are some of the most musically complex and interesting of anything in the musical theater realm. And it's interesting that a lot of his musicals don't have the same huge acclaim that others such as Andrew Lloyd Webber do. They don't have as broad of a fan base. Sondheim musicals, with some exceptions, I mean, I think most people are familiar with and love to some degree West Side Story, but maybe others aren't as familiar with Assassins or uh, why- Sunday in the Park with George. I mean, Into the Woods is a big one of his, but he has so many works that have not gotten the huge reception that other musicals have. And partly because his characters, his works, and musically, and because they are complex and they tend to be more internally focused rather than a spectacle. And that honestly really has nothing to do with the subject at hand. That is just something that comes to mind with Sondheim. And his take on Sweeney Todd, he's really the only composer that could give life to this bloody, macabre story that also has a lot of heart doesn't seem to be the right word, even if hearts are consumed, but has a lot of depth. And there's a sophistication with Sondheim works that I'm not going to say is lacking in some more popularized things, but it's just different. And you would not think of the subject of a musical to be a man who was exiled and came back. His wife was raped and went mad, and then he joins leagues with a woman named Mrs. Lovett, and they kill people and bake them into meat pies. Bring the kids, it's a musical. But it works, and it works so well because he fully embraces the darkness and the macabre. And that is present not only in the source material and the story itself, but it is baked into the music of the musical. So Sondheim basically used one thing to shape the entirety of the music of Sweeney Todd, that being the Dies Irae. Now, you might not be familiar with the Dies Irae, just, what is that? But you have heard it. It is a Gregorian chant that the origins of it are a little bit mixed. It goes back to the 13th century, possibly even earlier. But if you've watched almost any movie, you've heard the Dies Irae. It is pretty ubiquitous in film scores, and what Dies Irae means is Day of Wrath. It is based on Revelations and everything with that, with Jesus coming back and half of the world being sent into darkness, the war between God and Satan. That is what it is. The Dies Irae denotes death. In film scores, it has been used quite a bit. One of the most famous examples is the opening titles of The Shining, the Stanley Kubrick Shining, not the miniseries. Won't be talking about that today. But think about that as the Torrance's bug crawls up the Colorado mountainside up towards the Overlook Hotel, and you hear that bum 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 bum. That's one of the more overt examples. There are so many examples throughout film scores that could be a video on its own. There already are videos about that, but just a few examples in a Tim Burton adjacent work itself, Nightmare Before Christmas. The song Making Christmas has the Dies Irae. The Stampede score from Hans Zimmer in The Lion King, Dies Irae. In Star Wars, it's used a few times, but most notably when Luke comes across his home and finds that Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru are dead, you hear the Dies Irae. It's in Howard Shore's score for Lord of the Rings. It is all over the place. And every time it's used, it is used to represent death. And the beginning notes of Sweeney Todd, the Attend the Tale of Sweeney Todd, it is the Dies Irae. And the entire score of the musical is built around it. Sondheim uses it as the basis for the entire show. He will twist it, flip it upside down for one person's leitmotif, and maybe change it from a minor chord to a major chord. But the entirety of Sweeney Todd is sculpted around the Dies Irae, because this is a show about death, and in Sondheim's own words, a man in love with death. And what he said, I thought it would be useful to take the Dies Irae and use it as the basis of Sweeney's music, because he's a man who's in love with death in a way. And it gave me a start and gave me an atmosphere, because I've always found the Dies Irae both moving and upsetting at the same time. It scares me and moves me. So this is a show about death. Everything in the music tells you that people are going to die. But how brutally they die, the kills, and especially in the Tim Burton 2007 film adaptation, are fantastic and bloody and gruesome. Now, when Tim Burton was adapting the musical, he insisted on having a lot of blood. He felt that that was a core element of the story and of Sweeney's character. In Tim Burton's eyes, and he has spoken about it before, he views the spilling of blood as an emotional catharsis for Sweeney Todd. So much of his story, of his madness, his revenge, his grief is very internal. And the way that he gets that out of his system, the way that it is physically manifested for the audience, is through every time he kills someone. And is very telling, because not all of his kills are one and the same. As Sweeney Todd throughout the production kills random people with his barber, with his knives, and dumps them into the basement for Mrs. Lovett to bake them into the meat pies, most of them are a lot more restrained, almost elegant looking. It's really only his first and last on-screen kills that are impetuous isn't the right word, that are more brutal, especially his final kill, that being of Judge Turpin. But I'll kind of circle back to that. The use of blood in the Tim Burton film is something that I absolutely adore. And he does this also in Sleepy Hollow, which might be my favorite Tim Burton film. But the blood is bright red. It's goopy. It sprays everywhere. It is all over the place. And for Sweeney Todd, it actually was orange in color on set, because with the saturation that they were using with the film, it would look red in the final product, but it actually was this orange color, which I absolutely love. And most of the film of Sweeney Todd is very dark in its colors. there really is only one scene, which is more of a fantasy dream sequence that has a lot of light. But the red richness of the blood is such a juxtaposition to the dark grays, blues, blacks, and the dingy, smoky, dirty looking world of Victorian London. And it looks absolutely phenomenal on screen. Even if you don't like this movie as an adaptation of the musical, even if you don't like the movie, come on, you gotta give it props where it is due. Visually, it is absolutely stunning. And that is something that Tim Burton largely excels at, not in every film of his, especially later in his career, but the film of Sweeney Todd does have your Tim Burton isms. There are the black and white stripes. A lot of black and white. Most of the characters have bags and shadows under their eyes. The character of Sweeney Todd, Johnny Depp, did create the look kind of himself, but it is very much in that similar vein. Visual the visual things that we just associate with Tim Burton, where just everybody looks like they are running on 2 minutes of sleep over 20 years. Hey, that's my life. I'm a Tim Burton character. But anyways, I think a lot of people's issues with the film is it as an adaptation of the Sondheim musical. And with good reason. The opening number, the prologue, is cut from the movie. It is just an instrumental score. You don't have the ensemble Greek chorus that is very integral to the stage musical. That is that is entirely cut. The arc and romance between Joanna, Sweeney's daughter, and Anthony is largely cut. Joanna in the stage version is a much larger character. She has a lot more agency and an actual character. In the film, she's kind of reduced to almost a MacGuffin. And I can completely understand why people take issue with that. There are very important aspects of the musical that are completely thrown out for the film version. But it is an adaptation of a musical. And I think that most of the choices that Tim Burton makes for the movie are very good for a film adaptation. And even Sondheim was behind it and enjoyed what Tim Burton did. But adaptations are difficult because you have people who love the original work and people who are purists. And when you change things, you do risk alienating a big portion of your intended audience. But translating something from one medium to another is no easy feat. And things do have to be changed. Things that work in a stage musical that is usually given, say, 2.5 to 3 hours with a 15-minute intermission in between, don't usually work for a film that, generally 3 hours is kind of pushing it. And I think that a lot of the changes and cuts made for the film version were the right calls and give a different adaptation of the musical in a way that translates not only to film, but as a kind of a slasher movie that could not be done if you just stuck to basically a filmed version of the stage musical. And I, again, am a bit in the minority with some things about the movie. I actually think Johnny Depp does a pretty good job as Sweeney, both the acting and singing. There are some moments, singing wise, musically, that aren't as good as others. I think it's his first singing line in the movie was like, oh, we're going with that take, really? But Sondheim was huge on actors who can sing versus singers who could act. And there is a difference. Not saying that singing isn't important or isn't vital to these musicals, but it is more important to get the character and the feeling across than being technically perfect. And Johnny Depp is a great example of that. And I think he does quite well with the singing, given that he is not a trained singer. But you see so much going on in his head, behind his eyes, and he really displays the manicness of his need and quest for revenge versus being isolated from society and from everything that makes a person alive and human. And he's very good at that. And I think he does a very respectable performance. Now, that being said, we come into the matter of Helena Bonham Carter as Mrs. Lovett. Now, I adore Helena Bonham Carter as an actress. I think she is phenomenal, and I love how kind of kooky she is, and she's unafraid to be weird, and she was or is in a relationship with Tim Burton for a very long time. I don't know. I think they broke up and they got back together. I don't know the status of their relationship, but it's, there's enough love there for her to be in almost every single movie he does. But the interpretation of Mrs. Lovett in the film version is markedly different from the stage version of Mrs. Lovett. The film version has her much more reserved and tragic and sad. And I think in theory, that could be a good way to go. But in actual execution, I think it kind of does a disservice to the work as a whole and to Mrs. Lovett herself and her relationship with Sweeney Todd. I wish that Helena Bonham Carter had brought in a bit more Bellatrix Lestrange to her performance and been a bit more out there and more outrightly villainous, or at least antagonistic. Because what I love about the dynamic between Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett is so much that they are partners in crime. And she meets his madness and dials it up to 11. She's the one who puts it in his head to not only do the murders, well, that the murders are his thing, but hey, this is going to be good for business. Let's make them into meat pies. This will be a lot easier than trying to catch cats in the alleyway. We can profit off of this. And you don't get as much of that sense from the film version. She is much more longing for Sweeney Todd. And in some moments, it does work. In The Number by the Sea, which I absolutely adore. And the fact that Sweeney Todd is just completely out of it and does not care while she is expounding on this very idealistic, romantic idea of their future together, and he is just sitting there like, okay, whatever, I'm in my head, I don't care about what you're saying, when can I kill again? It's very funny. But the scene that really that lacks so much from the more understated version of Mrs. Lovett is the number A Little Priest. Sondheim wrote this as a comic relief. And in this number, it is when Mrs. Lovett presents the idea of baking all of Sweeney Todd's victims into her meat pies. And they're going on and looking out the world, debating who would be best for the meat. And the music is much more jaunty than what you get with most of the rest of the show. It's kind of almost a spastic, dark, but joyfully macabre waltz. And then in the film, it is just, the wordplay falls flat. It is mostly Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter just staring out the window. And that is, for me, the biggest fail of the film, just that number. That is one aspect of it that I wish had been done differently, that I would love to see redone with the same people, just with more life. Ironic in a show about a man who's in love with death. But there is so much in the performances in the film that I really, really do enjoy. And you cannot talk about the film version of Sweeney Todd without talking about Alan Rickman. He is absolutely wonderful in everything, and I miss that man so much. Because, we were close personal friends before his passing, obviously. But his Judge Turpin he's absolutely great. And again, he does play it a bit more understated than the stage versions. But with Alan Rickman, it just works. He is able to convey things, and it's just his line delivery is just so good. Although I will say he might be just a tad too Snape-y in the film. And it is kind of funny that Sweeney Todd is a big Harry Potter reunion, and then Johnny Depp would go on to be in the other Harry Potter adjacent movies. I can't think of their names right now. Mysterious Beasts and Where to Find Them, something along those lines. I saw the one movie, whatever. But yes, it is with Timothy Spall, Helena Bonham Carter, Alan Rickman. It's kind of funny in that way. But I just have to mention the Stranger Things of it all. In the film, the character of Anthony, who falls desperately in love with Sweeney Todd's daughter, Joanna, is played by Jamie Campbell Bower. Words. I'm good at them. But as I have talked about a bit in my Stranger Things episode, now he has gone on to play Vecna in Stranger Things, and he was also one of the Volturi in Twilight. And right now on Broadway, in the third Broadway revival, Gaten Matarazzo is playing Toby, which I absolutely adore. I love that there is that Stranger Things and other horror element components that you see in Sweeney Todd. And then going back to Harry Potter, in the in a more recent West End revival, Imelda Staunton played Mrs. Lovett, and I think most people recognize her primarily as Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter, and I know she played Queen Elizabeth in the latest season of The Crown. But yeah, just worlds colliding all over the place. Super fun. Uh, Now, I had something to say and it went out of my head.
Stranger Things?
Stranger things have happened. I don't know. Maybe I just need a good clean shave or something. But more about, so in the film, there is some amazing cinematography that I adore. There's one shot towards the beginning where the camera pans through the alleyways and streets of Victorian London. And it reminds me a little bit of a sequence in Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge, where the camera work is it's frenetic. It goes from fast, slows down, goes fast around, it's zipping around corners, and it's so well done. And originally, Tim Burton had kind of planned on most of the setting of London to be done via green screen. But then he realized that that would not work, and for the actors to not be in a physical space, in a physical environment, would take away from their performances and just from the atmosphere itself. And I am so glad that he went the route of, there is CGI in the film, but that he did bring in actual physical sets. And that really shows. And it has that classic Tim Burton style where everything is a little bit stilted. Nothing looks like it's on an actual 90-degree angle. And that is something that he does so well in Sleepy Hollow. And I shouldn't talk about Sleepy Hollow because I need to talk about that in a video of its own at some point. But that is just such a staple of the visual style of Tim Burton that I just really, really love. There is an amazing shot at the end of the song My Friends, where Sweeney Todd, he finds all of his razors and he says, "At last, my arm is complete again." And the music swells that Dies Irae, and the camera pans from a close-up shot of him, and it pans out through the window over the cityscape of London, and it's breathtaking. And then the entire sequence of the song Epiphany, which is one of my favorite songs of the musical and one of my favorite moments in the film, I think it is astoundingly well done. That you know that Sweeney Todd this is all in his mind, but you see him lurking through the streets and pausing at different people, potential victims. And the way the camera moves with him is invigorating and enthralling. And a lot of the camera movement moves along with the musicality of Sondheim's score. When it swells, it'll do a pan, or when it's softer moments, the cinematography gets closer. The way the film is shot echoes what is happening in the music, and it is a beautiful dance. And I'm just so here for it. And I think it is brilliant. And speaking of brilliant, Sacha Baron Cohen, I did not know that he was a singer, like a legit singer, when I saw this movie I think I saw this movie twice in theaters back in '07. But, I knew him from the Ali G Show and Borat. And I was astounded, like, oh, wow, he is multi-talented. My goodness. Yes, just wanted to throw out how good Sacha Baron Cohen is, and what I mentioned earlier before I go off on more tangents, but coming around to the actual kills. This is an R-rated movie, and Tim Burton insisted on that, with it being bloody, with it being gory, and for me, for most of the kills, it's not the slicing of the throat. It's when the chair dips back and the bodies fall into the basement, and there is a crack as their heads and spines meet the stone floor, and it is so gruesome and gross, and I absolutely love it. I love it, Mrs. Lovett. But the final kill that happens, not the final kill, actually, Sweeney's final kill, is him getting his final, long desired for revenge on Judge Turpin. And this is really the only kill that of Sweeney's that is completely unhinged. He stabs at him wildly. Blood is flying everywhere. It gets on the camera. He is completely drenched in this bright red Hammer horror style blood by the end of it. And you just see how both invigorated he is to finally beginning his revenge. But there is just a sense of emptiness and nothingness when it is done, because Sweeney Todd himself has been nothing but a shell this whole time. And throughout the movie and throughout the show, there is a beggar woman character who is kind of in and out of scenes, and she seems to be very invested in what's going on in Mrs. Lovett's place. And then you have that twist of the knife. When, after he is imprisoned and taken away from his wife and young daughter, Sweeney Todd's wife, Lucy, is raped by Judge Turpin, and she drinks poison. But what Mrs. Lovett fails to relay to Sweeney Todd when she is telling him of the fate of his wife, she only said she drank poison. She never said she died. His wife has been there all along. She was the beggar woman. And then she enters his old apartment where they had such a happy life together and sings, "Don't I know you, mister?" And with his revenge so close, Judge Turpin's on his way, he just slits her throat. And it's only later, looking at her body, that he realizes that it was his wife all along. And an even deeper, more gut-wrenching, all internal organs-wrenching twist of the knife is that the entire Barker family was in the room and alive at one point, and none of them knew it. At the end, Anthony has rescued Joanna, and they're running away together. She is disguised as a boy. She's hiding in a trunk in the room. And at one point, Benjamin Barker is in the room with his wife, Lucy, with his daughter, Joanna, and none of them know it. He kills Lucy and finds Joanna in the trunk and lets her go. It's kind of a strange moment in the film. The stage version that works a bit better, but it's just heartbreaking when you realize that had there just been a moment of pause, and maybe had Sweeney Todd not been so obsessed with his revenge, there might have been the slightest chance of realization and reconciliation. And that never happens. And it's so sad. And we have to talk about the death of Mrs. Lovett. So she has had feelings for Sweeney Todd for all this time. And she doesn't lie to him, but doesn't tell him the truth about the fate of his wife. And he, even though he has killed the judge, now she is the one who has the blame for him missing out on any potential of having any kind of life with his family. So he throws her in the oven, and it's gruesome. And I have to wonder if there were issues in the relationship between Tim Burton and Helen Bonham Carter at the time, because the camera really seems to relish her burning up, screaming in agony in the giant oven. It is so dark, and it's the imagery of her burning. It stays with you. It's pretty gnarly, but it's very well done in like the best and worst kind of way. But I really have to hand it to the film for the construction of the ending and Sweeney Todd's death. Mrs. Lovett is burning up. She's got some, that burning love. It's happening. And he is holding the body of his wife. And young Toby, who has been taken in by mostly Mrs. Lovett, but also Sweeney Todd, and he has realized what the two of them have been up to this whole time. And as Sweeney is holding his wife in his arms and realizing everything he's lost in his quest for revenge, Toby slits his throat with one of Sweeney Todd's own razors. And the blood effect is really, I love it. It looks like there is a curtain of blood that just opens up and falls down his throat. And the blood drips onto Lucy's face as he slumps over. And it creates this morbidly beautiful tableau. And with the strains of the Dies Irae and Sondheim's score, the movie comes to a very understated and sad and dark end. We do not have the epilogue, the final number that you get in the stage musical. But I do think it works for the film because it leaves you with this sense of just sadness and hopelessness and darkness. And the thing is, with a film, you don't have the cathartic release of a curtain call. There isn't that kind of sense where no matter what has happened in the show, you're like, okay, well, now it's over. We can applaud the performances and see, okay, this was all just for, it was all play. It was pretend. And we can be left with everything from the show, but still have that bit of emotional release that, okay, these are people, and we're occupying the same space, and we can just now applaud their performance and talk about it and let it sit, but kind of relax. And that is something that I love about the medium of film, that it's a very different kind of, you view it in a very different way. And when something has a bleak ending, that's just it. And that's what we are left with. And you have this music and this story and this character about and in love with death. And what other way is, like, what better way for a film that loves, whose characters love death and have lost their humanity, for it to end with just blood and darkness. And I really respect the film for being able to go there. And as a horror musical, both the stage and the film version, Sweeney Todd has left a mark in ways that others have not. Because it's Victorian in its setting and tone, and when you have Stephen Sondheim helming the creativity and the music behind it, it stands on a level that, say, I don't know, Carrie the musical doesn't. And I think Little Shop of Horrors is one of my favorite musicals of all time. It's a great horror musical, but that is more comedy based on a B movie. And a lot of horror musicals tend to be more camp or more melodramatic. And Sweeney Todd, definitely not campy. Maybe there's melodrama, but not in the same way as, say, Jekyll and Hyde or Phantom of the Opera. It relishes its darkness and the death, and it has humor, it has life. It's very, very invigorating. But it never crosses the line of winking to the audience or like, oh, we're laughing with you, or we're laughing at something. And I think that's part of why it is so strong. And Tim Burton's film really leaning into the gruesome, macabre horror aspect of it, the slasher aspect of it, and just getting into the bleakness and the darkness and the hopelessness of it all is why it succeeds. And maybe you don't like it because you don't like musicals. Maybe you don't like it because you love the musical too much, or not too much, but you love the musical more than the film. And that is valid, and I get it. But I personally think that it works on most levels. And the fact that Sondheim himself was impressed with and proud of it really, really speaks volumes. And that's where I'm going to cut it for tonight. I thank you for indulging me going down into the depths of musical theater, whatnot, and just all of my wild and crazy thoughts. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that maybe, even if you don't like the movie, or even if you don't like musicals, maybe you'll have a bit of an appreciation for it. Now, as always, I'm Aleece with the Late Late Horror Show, and stay spooky, my friends.